Welcome back. As promised before the break, we are joined by a guest. You've heard us talk about him on the show before, you've heard the ads. He is the one, the only, the author of the brand new memoir, Color of Melancholy. He is my fellow Canadian, Steve Stred. Steve, welcome to the Ghost Story, guys.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, man. Like I said, we've done those fun ads for you before, and said ridiculous things that you thankfully went along with, and so it's nice to finally have you here. How's life treating you?
Good, yeah, and I'm pretty much up for anything for ads. I enjoy the serious and I enjoy the funny, so it's always been great when you send them over and hearing what they are. So
Very cool. So, Steve, as I mentioned, you've got a brand new book out. You've got the Color of Melancholy, your memoir. I'm only about halfway through it, I have to admit, but I've been loving it so far. How has the response been?
oh, thanks. Um, Better than expected. I figured it would be something where I would be the only person to buy a copy. Um, it's one of those things where you know, I did it more kind of as a cathartic experiment and all through my life, everyone's always said like you should journal, and I'm just not a journaler. And at this stage in life, I'm also not. Uh, I don't think I have the time to dedicate to seeing like a counselor full on.
Right.
So this was kind of my way of journaling and almost self counseling by putting the puzzle pieces of my life together and just kind of finding that common thread throughout all of it. But yeah, the response has been amazing. I was pleasantly surprised.
That's very cool. And the I don't have the subtitle of the book handy, but the book is almost an examination of how your life has intertwined with the work of Andrew Pyper.
Yeah. So, geez, what's it been? Two years ago that me and Andrew were on together.
Yeah, about that.
Somewhere around there. But um, you know, again, I grew up in the middle of nowhere, which I kind of begin some of the book with, and I never really had access to Goodreads. There wasn't internet back then when I was younger, and our town library was very very small. So it's not like I had a lot of options for what I wanted to read and what interested me. And it was 2015 or so when I first kind of stumbled across Andrew's books, and it was just one of those ones where it immediately spoke to me, and I found it phenomenally fascinating that here is this author who's writing this type of fiction who is Canadian and lives in Canada. And I couldn't believe it. But there's also just been this odd, I don't know if synchronicity is the right phrase for it, but whenever something crazy is going on, his books tend to be around for it. And so much so that me and you are participating in a read along of one of his books here in September. But I decided to reread one of his books recently, and I had somebody in the family passed away, and it's just one of those things where somebody passed away in my family, and I happen to be reading one of Andrew's books, and it's odd how it's always this strange connecting of dots between a major life event, and I always happen to be involved in one of Andrew's books.
Yeah, you open the book with a pretty harrowing story of your wife and son, basically your son's birth and very brief death, and you talk about that happening while you're reading the wildfire season. And
Yeah,
I got to say, man, that my heart was in my throat.
yeah, I've been trying to warn people about chapter one, and I think in every single blurb I've received from it, people have said something about the opening chapter or that first chapter kind of kicks them in the stomach or kind of rocks them. And um, I thought it was a prudent chapter to start with, so that people can also trust that I'm not really going to be holding back. That
Sure.
it's not. It's not a lukewarm retelling of things. I'm pretty descriptive, and I'm pretty outgoing about that. And it's just one of those things where I felt to build trust with the readers who have only read me fictionally. In a nonfiction piece, you need to have not only that kind of big bang at the start that you usually have in a fiction piece, but also that okay, like, he's going to be honest and open about things. And then, yeah, of course, it just happened to be that I had just literally started reading the wildfire season, and I didn't even know the book was gone because we removed rooms, and then the nurse brought it back to me a few days later when I was leaving the hospital, and it was just crazy that in Foothills Hospital in Calgary that has all these people and coming and going, that she saw me in the lobby area and had it to grab for me, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, I cracked the book when I was on a harbor flight over to Vancouver last week, because someone who a friend of mine was suddenly ill, and I wanted to go see check on him. And given the nature of my trip, reading that opening chapter, I actually had to put it away for a while
oh
because
geez.
it was too yeah, it was a little too close to the bone, because again, you don't hold back, and it's hairy. And I really admire that, man, because that's something I don't know if I would have the same courage to be able to be so open about things like not just the chapter with what happens to your wife Amanda and your son, but to really just in general to be open about your perceived flaws and faults, and really the growing up stuff. You know, you and I grew up in similar places,
Yeah.
actually very geographically close to each other,
Yeah, like
as
what,
we discovered.
2 hours maybe.
Maybe, yeah, tops.
Yeah.
And you were very open about growing up in a way that was maybe some of some of the negative things about the way you were raised by your family. And again, I must imagine that's a difficult thing to be open with, because I imagine people don't like reading that about themselves.
No, and again, I think for a long time, especially, I mean, Paul, I'm not sure how many people were kind of where you lived when you grew up, but I know like with Brendan, you Revelstoke had a bit more than the cusp surrounding area. Not much, but a bit more. But
Mm.
for a long time, you're almost ashamed of having been from this small town, and even now, like oddly enough, this morning, one of the people I saw at work here just came back from going out to see one of his family members in Castlegar, which isn't far from where you and I grew up. Um, and immediately I was like, "Oh yeah, that's crazy! Like I'm from the cusp," and then it's so ingrained in me to say I'm from the cusp, even though I'm not from the cusp. I'm from somewhere even smaller and outside of it. But if you were to try to find Burton on a map, you're not going to find it, right? You'll find Kelowna first, and then from there you'll find Vernon, and then Revelstoke. Like it'll take you a bit to even find the cusp. Um, so I think I'm kind of that weird product of how I grew up, but also wanting to be the big city kid.
Sure.
So I relate to having like the party line growing up, and I relate to having, you know, um, playing on the men's soccer team while one of the town's physicians is on the men's soccer team. And it's weird that, you play soccer with him and then you see him for a checkup, and then on the weekend he's partying with you in the bush, like, um, so it's this weird kind of like, environment where you're like, man, this is cool that I grew up in the middle of nowhere in the woods. But then you're also like, I hated growing up in the middle of nowhere in the woods because we only had 3 TV channels. The Sears catalog was our mall, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, and I know, like, I try to say it not to be a spoiler for you in the book. I try to say it later on that I know my parents tried to do the best they could,
Sure.
but it there's a lot of us who grew up in similar situations, which I'm finding out, where our parents really did consider us as a nuisance, and kids that should be there just because you have kids and they need to be quiet and they need to stay by themselves in the corner because the adults are visiting, and it just the the book's almost been out a week now, and even in that short time, the few people have read it, I've had a lot of messages from them saying, "That's so crazy! Like that's the same thing that I had growing up, where my parents, we were a nuisance, we were in the way, we were, we did stuff as a family, but it was stuff that they wanted to do, and the kids were just there." So it hurts to hear so many people say that, but at the same time, um, we're kind of considered that generation of change, where now I'm trying to be better than they were to me, and and we all know the world's going crazy right now. So the more nicer and kinder we can be, I think the better.
Absolutely. Paul, was that like that for you growing up? Were kids sort of meant to be, the seen and not heard kind of thing?
Well, usually they were just born into a life of servitude. So from
Yeah,
an early age, you're trained how to make grandparents' cup of tea their preferred way, and
right.
how to you can go to the shops and buy their cigarettes and alcohol for them. As you take a note with you,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
they always say, "Look, don't smoke that on the way back, or don't open it, don't drink that." Um, obviously it wasn't that, there was my high school, which was in here, there was 1,400 pupils, so it wasn't, we're a small mining village, really, but it wasn't that small because they're all separate communities, but they're all very, very close together. In some places, you'll not know where one village stops and the other starts, but the people who live there know. They know where that border is, and so it's very strange that I think when you do something like that, Steve, it's quite cathartic. I know somebody from over here I've got to know quite well, Paul Sinclair, recently, his last book was kind of a paranormal memoir of his life growing up and the strange experiences. But there was also a lot of rawness about his upbringing and how he was treated, that kind of, speak when you're spoken to, and then other than that, just keep out the way. And I think for a lot of us growing up in that sort of 70s and 80s era, most of the time, I suppose a lot of people were like that. I was very fortunate. My family were very kind of happy to congregate and hang around, and there was always, tons of relatives at Christmas, and people had always come around on a Saturday. So, and we were always kind of encouraged to join in. But there was always times where, parents wanted to watch something on the television, and we'd get told to bugger off. So it's the same the world over, it would seem.
Yeah, I'm curious, Paul, in terms of the small town thing, did you have that where you would, the kind of, there weren't as many class divisions, so you would end up, you would see, say, the town doctor or the town mayor doing something crazy, and then, Friday he'd be, or Monday he'd be back in the office looking proper?
Oh no, there is a very, even in a rough and tough mining village like ours, there is a divide. There is the haves and the have-nots, and the majority of us were the have-nots. But there were the people, because there's a couple of very posh schools near here as well.
Right.
One was a grammar school that had its own bus service that came around and picked everybody up. So obviously, all us locals used to throw eggs at their bus. That's what teach them, wanting to bet themselves. How dare they? And then there was also a couple of, there was Wakefield Girls' School and Queggs, which was Queen Elizabeth Grammar School, which were both near, one was in Wakefield, one was near Wakefield. And a lot of people kind of gravitated. That would be, I've made it, I've got out, educational wise.
Right.
I've gone across the border, I can do it. So there was always that kind of temptation for a lot of people that sort of people wanted to move upwards without sort of moving away, if that makes sense.
That whole private school thing, that's completely foreign to me as a concept, because obviously where I grew up in Revelstoke, again, not far from Burton, where Steve grew up, there used to be maybe 4 elementary schools, and there was elementary schools and then 1 high school. The idea of a private school didn't even occur to me.
Yeah.
And then I came here to Victoria, where there's this St. Michael's University school. Everyone calls it this, SMU. And to me, it's just another high school, I thought. And then I was educated, like, no, you rube, you buffoon. This is where you go when you matter, when you have money. And I thought, oh, that's why I don't know what it is.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I passed the entrance exam for Queggs, but I wouldn't go. I just wanted to prove I could get in, but I didn't go.
The Paul Bestel story started early.
Yeah, well, it really annoyed me stepdad. Really annoying, because he really wanted me to go there and I didn't want to go. So I thought, well, I'll prove I can get in. Because if I threw it and failed the exam, then he'd say, oh, well, you didn't deserve to go. But I smashed it. And then I said I didn't want to go. And he was livid.
And then you ended up on a phone call with me. So I guess he was right, Paul.
And 40 years later, I've regretted it ever since. No. It's just, that's not me. It's not the kind of, I've met many people who went to that school. I'd have been expelled within a year, I think.
Yeah, that's fair.
Or on the news.
or both.
Probably both, yeah.
when I was growing up, we had the same thing where it was really stratified. Very much a have and have-nots, even though it was like a small town. But I remember getting a little bit older, and I think that's changing a little bit. I think as kind of reaching our middle age here, um, I remember going to a party in Revelstoke, maybe about 10 years ago, and there was this guy there, and he was a local pharmacist, and he was smashed, just smashed, and not shy about being smashed. And someone said to him, they said, "Hey, aren't you worried about like your reputation? You're here, you're gooned, you're hitting on our friend." And he said, "No, none of you people matter." Um, so I don't know. Maybe the stratification is still there. I'm not sure now that I think about it.
Paul, did you have anybody? And again, this might be a little bit naive or a little bit me not knowing more about it, but did you have anybody from your local, like from where you grew up, who kind of made it to the big time? And that was kind of like I'm thinking about like, for instance, everybody talks about like Black Sabbath, they come out and they, change the face of heavy metal music. And you think about some of these, kind of working class folk who hit the big time, and we don't have anybody like that. Our stories from where I grew up in the cusp is, like right now the big one is what's his name, Kim Coates, who was on Sons of Anarchy.
Oh yeah.
Like every summer he comes and goes out to Nakusp for a couple of days to visit, and every time he does, it's like on the local Facebook page, and people are can't believe that this guy has come to visit this town. So we never had anybody who really kind of burst out and became like a big movie actor or musician or anything like that. I'm just curious, did you have that? Did you have that person who kind of busted out of those locks and chains and became a big face for everyone?
Well, we've got a few. We've got several England cricketers from the area who got out. The current, well, one of the most famous ones that we had around here is a local lad called Darren Goff, who was a very popular member of the England cricket team and a world class performer. So we've had several cricketers make it. Several footballers have made it to the big time through all there. Joanne Harris, the author who wrote Chocolat, she's from around here. Kate Roysby, the world-known folk singer, she's from around here. And my uncle was the original drummer of Saxon and left them and went to work for Def Leppard for 20 years. So, yeah, some of them did all right. But it was a very tortuous journey. If you basically, unless you played sport, where there was, you could play any sport around here, cricket, football, rugby union, and people would, you had a channel to find your way out.
Mm-hmm.
Music, nothing. You had to basically form a band and go somewhere else. So a lot of them, kind of like Saxon, did a lot of the pubs and clubs, and then sort of gravitated towards Sheffield because there was a big metal scene in Sheffield. And obviously Def Leppard was sort of coming through at the same time. So they were all able to sort of congregate in that area. Doncaster was another. Doncaster's very similar to Barnsley, that it has that kind of, unless you're very specifically talented in a certain way, it's just normal. That is your only option. Normal life. That is it. And Doncaster is the same. It's a massive rock venue place. It's always had a real love of metal and rock music for decades. But nobody makes it there. They all have to go. Even if they have to just go 10 miles down the road. Sheffield kind of pulled. Anybody in South Yorkshire got magnetically pulled into Sheffield's orbit. And then all of a sudden they're all from Sheffield then.
Yeah. Interesting, yeah.
Revelstoke had the great Michael Bufero, director of such hits as 5G The Reckoning and The Barber, starring Malcolm McDowell. So he's our guiding star.
Now I'd almost think Revelstoke's more known for the Red Bull guys who come there and film their videos and stuff.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's more known for the location. I remember the Crusty Demons videos used to play in the bars. Which, Paul, I don't know if are you familiar with Crusty Demons?
No.
It's a series of like snowboarding and snowmobile trick videos, and so though I think they used to shoot some of those around there, and they would always play them in the bars on the big screens.
Was the big guy? His name was Warren Miller, right? That's who put out all those ski videos,
I
right?
that sounds right. Yeah, yeah.
So these
Warren
ones
Miller or
wanted to
snowboarding.
be like Warren Miller's, but only it was more like kind of indie punk and almost like bootlegged videos where one would be released to a video store and the rest would then be re-recorded over and over and
They sold exactly one copy, and then everything else was just pirated.
pretty much,
So
Well, it keeps your feet on the ground, I suppose.
that's it. Well, that's a small town thing, right? You don't get ideas above your station.
No, no. Stay close, stay tethered.
Yep, exactly. Steve, I was kind of curious. I'd love if you to talk a little bit about how you were. So obviously, as you started to get out of Nakusp, you still sort of had your adventures in the region, and of course, at one point you were a bartender, or sorry, not a bartender, you were a bouncer
yeah.
in a club. And I have to say, I'm not surprised because you are a giant man. In like, I remember when I first met you, I'm like, oh, he could beat the shit out of me. I mean, yep, that's. And I asked you, do you lift weights? And you're like, no. And I'm like, well, clearly at some point you have, because you look like you were hewn from granite.
Yeah.
So, and I discovered, oh, this man was a bouncer. Yeah, that fits. But that ended in truly horrifying fashion. I wonder if you just just as a little bit of a teaser for the book, talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's almost exact. Like we're right around the 20. I think the 20-year mark now. Might be the 19-year mark. It's hard. All those early 20 years, they kind of blend together now, or those 2000s, I guess. But yeah, it was one of those ones where there wasn't a lot of places to work, and I kind of wanted a job that I didn't have to really do anything, but then also I could make some cash and have time to work out and I mean, obviously this is almost like an entitled thinking. I wanted a job where I didn't have to work, I could make some cash under the table, and I didn't have to work like 5 days a week. And it just happened that the guy so I was renting a room for my friend, but his dad owned the house. And so he was working a bit as a bouncer at the kind of the one club at that time in Castlegar. And he was like, oh, I could see if they're looking for anybody else, because none of the bouncers that were working there wanted to work there. Like it was all a second job for them, and they just kind of did it because they needed the bodies. And I was like, absolutely. Like I don't drink. Like I'm not going there to get drunk. I want to make I think it was like $20 an hour for 5 hours a night, and it was all cash, and work 4 days a week from essentially 10 p.m. till 2 a.m. and the rest of the time was free, and it was enough money to pay my rent and food and stuff. So I was like, okay, this is perfect. And I only worked there for a couple months, because then one night there was kind of a mixture of odd groups kind of coming into the bar, and one of them was a bachelor party. And it is called a bachelor party, right? I think you guys call it something over there, but it was
Stags.
a stag do. Is that what it is?
Yeah, stag party.
Yeah. So a guy was getting married, and him and his friends were out, and at the same time there happened to be like a very low class version of like the Thunder from Down Under Aussie strippers in town at the same time. So we had all of these like drunk, like 40, 50-year-old women coming to the bar. But we also had this group of drunk guys coming to the bar. And the guy who was getting married was wearing a wedding dress with nothing underneath it. But that coincided with, they didn't come till later. I think they got there about midnight. And so at about 11 o'clock, nobody was in the pub. It was dead. So they let 4 of the bouncers go. So there was just me and another bouncer, Pete, who was there. And Pete, I don't know what became of him in the years since, but he was the most unathletic, nerdy, out of shape guy I probably had ever met. He had a big hunchback. He wore his jeans up to his nipples. He was the polar opposite of what you think of as a bouncer. He's probably 5'7", 5'8", and I wouldn't be surprised if he was pushing 400 pounds.
Oh man.
So the guy with the wedding dress kept lifting the dress up to show the women his tackle box, and they got upset with that. And instead of Pete kind of asking him not to do it, Pete forcefully told him not to do it, and a massive fight broke out. Um, Pete scurried under a table somewhere, which I found after, but essentially, kind of the two biggest guys in the entire town were there, and one of them was helping us, and the other one wasn't helping us. And at one point, me and this guy kind of came face to face, and I was like, we just need to stop this. We need to get going. And as I was talking to him, and he was kind of telling me that he would help out, I just got smashed in the side of the head with something. Pretty sure it was brass knuckles. Like, I'm pretty sure the force that was used was something like that. But I just kind of stumbled around, and one of the ladies that was there kind of grabbed me and pulled me outside, and I was getting angry at her because I was like, "Why are you like? There's this thing going on inside. Why am I outside?" And she was like, "Because you're hurt." And I didn't believe her. And then she had me bend over, and when I bent over, like the entire front of my shirt and pants just got covered in blood. Like I was bleeding profusely. And I was like, okay, like sure, like whatever, I'm bleeding. So I went back in, and we got everything sorted. And the police are an odd group in that they wouldn't come into the bar if the fight was still going on because of liability issues. So they had to wait till everybody left the bar to then kind of start clearing people out. So everybody cleared out. Pete drove me to the Trail Hospital, which is about half hour away, and I got 6 stitches above my eye. And then a week later, I went, and so then at that point, I couldn't see out of my one eye. It was swollen up like just massively. And they said, you're gonna have to get these stitches removed. We can't, they won't just dissolve. So a week later, I was in the cusp, and went to our family doc to get them cut out. And she was like, "Did you have X-rays done?" And I said, "No, I had these stitches." And she was like, "Okay, well, let's take the stitches out and we'll get X-rays done." And it was like my whole cheek, upper part of my face, like all of it was like just smashed, fractured. I had a whole bunch of fragments surrounding my optic nerve. They thought I was going to either lose all the vision in my eye or lose my eye because of how much they were pressing against it, because I had so much swelling internally. And so then essentially I was whisked away, which is out there, is a 3.5 hour drive to Kelowna for surgery. And then I think my surgery was delayed twice because emergency surgeries came in. So I got prepped for surgery twice, and then twice it didn't happen. And then so then finally I had the surgery, and I think I wrote it in the book, but I actually have trouble remembering. It was something like 175 fractures that they had to piece together, and they used I don't know the phrase for it. It's like a bone putty, to kind of put everything back together, and then it solidifies over time, and it kind of calcifies and doesn't become real bone, but enough of a real bone that it's your head looks normalish again. But yeah, it was like, geez, a year before I got my peripheral vision back. I was like dizzy most of the time, and so yeah. So after the surgery, I spent that summer, actually read all 3 of the Lord of the Rings books with one eye.
Oh man.
It's just, I sat outside on a crappy camping chair, and I would essentially read all day. And then once my now wife, but once Amanda, who's my girlfriend back then, once she was done her job, I would then, either get a ride up to her place in the cusp from Burton, or a few times I actually drove when I wasn't supposed to drive. But then I would hang out with her, and then kind of repeat the next day. But yeah, so it was a strange time, kind of going through that.
Well, if you've got one eye, Steve, Lord of the Rings is a good trilogy to read, sir. It's almost as if you're trying to emulate Sauron's eye.
Yeah, yeah. The only thing that it was, because as you know, Brendan, that area in the summertime can get awfully hot. And so I'd be sitting out there, and I would just start sweating, and then the sweat would go into my eye, and I couldn't wipe it out. So it would just be burning. So then I would go, and I would just like put a garden hose over my head while holding the book away, because I didn't want it to get wet. And then I would go back and read some more until I would sweat into my eye. And yeah.
And what I find remarkable about that, Steve, is you took that savage hit from brass knuckles. You spent a year healing, and then you thought, I'm going to get in a bobsled.
Yeah.
This will protect the integrity of my human friend.
We wear helmets.
Oh, okay. I just loved that. I mean, obviously, I didn't know that about you until I met you in Toronto a couple months
Yeah.
back, that you had done this. And again, that part of the book, it's wonderful because just bonkers. And obviously, like the amount of work you put in to get where you got. I mean, you mentioned because you were originally doing shot put,
Yeah.
and you were about 370 pounds, as I recall you saying.
Yeah, that was about the heaviest I got.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then when you decided to do bobsled, obviously you had to get smaller, and you dropped 100 pounds.
Yeah. Well, I mean, technically, over the course of 18 months, it would have been 100 and what's that math? 130 pounds, 125
Wow.
pounds. Because I lost 25 pounds to then be able to go up and try it the one time in Whistler.
Right.
Just so I knew I would fit into the sled, because there's not a lot of space in there. But so then, yeah, I did that. And then kind of when I got the go ahead from Canada to be like, if you can get to this, we want you at the tryout camps. Because I went to a couple of tryout camps at like 370 pounds. And, I'm just like, there's like bobsled's a sport with big guys. But then when you're, 100 pounds heavier than the next guy, not only are you, the slowest at the camp, but you're also the one that kind of sticks out. And, all of the coaches were like, get the weight down because we want to see what you can do, with that weight off because you're fastish now. You theoretically you'll be faster then. And so it was just one of those things where, I just one track mind. I was like, because since growing up, I've always wanted to be an Olympian. And even now, and knowing I'll never be an Olympian, a part of me is still like, man, it'd be cool to be an Olympian. But bobsled had never really been on my radar. It's like that sport that every Winter Olympics comes on, everybody watches it, but then like nobody's ever done it, and everybody watches it because they want to see people crash, right? But so I didn't really know how to really go about getting into it, and it just kind of did the research on it, and I went up to Whistler and tried it the one time, and I was like, this is crazy, this is cool, and I had that kind of a epiphany moment standing on top of Whistler Blackcomb of the snow coming down and my eyes looking at everything in slow motion and just being like, this is where I need to be, in life. And and in the book, I make no qualms about how incredibly selfish that decision was as well. It's just you have to be selfish to kind of pursue a goal like that, much to the detriment of pretty much everybody else around you in your life. But I I say I wouldn't change a thing, but I would. Like if I had a redo of it, I don't know if I would have pursued it. It's
Interesting.
given me a lot of life experience and life moments and memories, but it's also the most difficult, hardest sport in the world, and my body's paid the price for that now.
Yeah, there's a story in there, man, and we won't spoil it for our listeners because I do want them to go pick up the book. But you talk about a crash. I think it's at corner 13
Yeah, corner
at the
14.
Whistler track, or 14, yeah. And man, it's when I said the bartending or the bouncing story was harrowing. This is next level.
Yeah.
I was tense again the whole time reading it, and we'll let the listeners discover that when they pick up a copy of the book. But it was, yeah. Again, you kept going back, and I got to say how much I admire that.
Yeah, I mean, again, completely foolish and kind of that immature young man mentality, even though I was like 30 at that point, right? But you kind of had that invincibility in your head. But then at the same time, I was battling severe anxiety. I didn't know it at that time. I didn't know that this was a, I didn't know that was like, this is what a panic attack is. When
Right.
you're sitting in the room and you got to get ready to go. And then you think about just how crappy your coach is towards you, and you start to struggle to have to breathe, and you feel like you're going to puke, and suddenly you think you're having a heart attack. And your roommate, who's at that time, he was a skeleton athlete on the national team. He's like, like, what's going on with you, man? Like, let's go. We got to get going. And you physically don't know if you're gonna live for another minute, because you're just like in the throes of this. And then you mention it to your coach, and you get just completely dumped on about not being a real man, and
Man up.
just that old school coach mentality of suck it up or don't suck it up and get out of my way. And so it was a tough one, because again, for many years, and I try not to sound arrogant, but for many years I was always one of the bigger people in a room, and one of the people who could lift more weight than a lot of the other people. And then the person that you're looking for guidance from kind of just doesn't give that to you, and treats you like crap. It's tough. It's a tough thing.
Yeah, yeah. That was the shocking treatment of Canadian athletes. Really, really was a surprise to me. I mean, obviously the coach you're describing, as you say in the book, like, he is someone people will know if they are familiar with sort of the more famous, bobsled teams, that they will know who this coach is.
Yeah.
And it was shocking, and not just his behavior, but the general treatment of Canadian athletes, the funding. I was really surprised by that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in Canada, you're hearing a lot of the stories come out, especially over the last kind of few years of kind of the poor treatment. But I think the harder thing to kind of accept is that it's in the sliding sports for sure, and it's happening in other sports as well. But from top to bottom, doesn't matter what level you're at, whether you're Kaylee Humphreys, who's a multi-Olympic gold medalist who ended up leaving the country to compete for the U.S., or you're just somebody starting out trying to get your foot in the door. You were treated poorly, and you were treated like crap, and at the end of the day, you're a body bag with numbers, right? How fast can this athlete X push? If he's not pushing faster than athlete Y, then see you later.
Yeah, it's sobering stuff, man. So we only have Steve for a limited amount of time, so we're going to start winding it down. But before we go, of course, this is a ghost show, and Steve, you had your own ghostly encounter in which you document in the book, and we've actually shared the other story. You have Amanda's story on the
Yeah.
show previously, but I would love, because you tell it in such a way that it's not even really a ghost story. This is just a thing that happened, and I love stories like that, because that's typically the way these things happen. Prior to you having your experience, which again we'll let folks read about in the book, did you have much of a sense of that kind of thing? Were you a believer in ghost stories?
I don't know if I was a believer. I think I've always been somebody who's like, a want a believer.
Right.
And growing up out there, I was always more like Bigfoot and Ogopogo.
Sure.
Especially like uh, I've been devouring Arlene Gall's Ogopogo books. And my aunt worked for her as a cleaner for like one brief summer in Vernon, and
Oh, cool.
she had some of her books that she gave to me. And so there's kind of a connection of like this person's a real person. It's not just somebody making up stories of a thing in the lake. So I was always more kind of on that fence of the creature side of it, and on the ghost side of it, it was like, well, maybe they can happen. um but then, yeah, like, Amanda's wholeheartedly a believer in ghosts. And so then, kind of had that experience that's in the book. And it was just like, oh, okay, well, this is something different. This is a new thing to try to process.
Hmm.
Yeah, because as I recall, your father he told you a Sasquatch story
Yeah,
when you were
well, so
younger.
I mean, again, it's one of those small town ones where Lemon Creek, kind of towards Winlaw,
Right.
is kind of a hotbed of Bigfoot sightings. And my dad spent his entire life in the bush as a logger, and so I always was asking him, like, "Have you seen Sasquatch? Have you seen Bigfoot?" Um, and again, he's always been somebody who's been like, it's possible. I mean, if you spend any time in British Columbia woods, they're massive. It's hard to put it into scope how big it is. And there's people who have lived in the British Columbia wilds their entire lives who've never seen a cougar. There's people who lived in the woods in BC their entire lives, never seen a black bear. And so for me, Bigfoot has always been a plausible possibility. There's a lot of wilderness there. And so my dad, he told me the story because I had asked about it. And so the guy who owned the logging company that he worked for at the time had stopped to get a drink at the Lemon Creek Creek there because it's, the fresh water type thing. And all of those old guys always swore by, you got to fill up your water at the creek. And my grandpa did that too. Always had to stop on the way to Vernon because there was one specific runoff of water that's the cleanest water in all of the world. But so in Lemon Creek, this guy had stopped, and he was a big guy. He's probably 6'5", 6'6", and just one of the big bush guys. And he filled up his jug, and I guess he stood up and looked over, and at the same time, this hairy hominid stood up and looked over, and they were, 20, 30 feet away from each other on the other sides of the creeks. And they both just kind of looked at each other for a bit. And then he slowly went back up to his truck and drove away. And he said he never could explain what it was, but he said it towered over him. And so it's just one of those things. And I think is it the BC Bigfoot, BCBR? They have their own website. But if you go on there, there's like hundreds of reported sightings along that area of, potential Bigfoot in that spot. So, yeah, always has fascinated me.
Even I've heard of Lemon Creek all the way over here because of its reputation as being a hotspot in that particular area for sightings. I mean, that just shows you as well, Steve. You've got an experienced outdoorsman, spends his life outside. He clearly knows what he saw. And he clearly knows what it wasn't. And yet people go, no, you're wrong. You've seen a bear.
And it's interesting. It's always interesting. That one's interested me specifically because he's one of those guys who's not a BSer.
Yeah.
He's one of those guys who, if you asked him, he would have told you the story. But if he didn't, he's not, trying to let people know. It's just, 15 years ago, it's just something that happened. It's not a big sensational moment where, he's overtly looking for recognition about it or anything. And that's always just kind of stuck with me.
Very, very cool stuff. Well, unfortunately, we have to wind it up. Our guest tonight, of course, has been Steve Stred, author of The Color of Melancholy, an examination of Andrew Pyper's novels as intersected through my life. Folks, I can't recommend it enough, not just because Steve's a great guy, and again, essentially my neighbor growing up, but because it is a great read as well. You can get it now on Amazon. Steve, you can get paperback or Kindle, correct?
And hardcover.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, there we go. You'll find a link in the show notes. You'll be hearing an ad for it probably over the course of the next month on the show as well, just to remind you, in case you don't get it. Steve, Steve, where can everyone find you online?
My website's stevestredauthor.ca. Otherwise, I'm pretty active on, do we call it X now? Is it X?
You certainly don't.
You can find me on Twitter at Steve Stred, or Instagram at Steve Stred, or pretty much anywhere people are congregating socially online, you'll find me at Steve Stred.
Brilliant. And folks, this is a man who jumped his bike over a bear. You should be following him on social media.
Also, thank you guys.
Thanks so much, Steve.